Hello, everyone. Welcome to Libraries in Response, session 126 in our series that began, as many of you know, back at the dawn of the pandemic. The pandemic was declared. We were all freaking out about how contagious, how lethal, what to do. Everything suddenly was closed. And we posed the question, well, what then is a library if the building is closed? It's not nothing, but what? And that just started a conversation that we're still having today. Not just that topic, of course, but it was the point that it was libraries needing to respond to the crisis, the health crisis. And then very quickly after that, it was the social crisis created by the Floyd murder. And then we had the economic crisis. And then the political crisis and the ever-present climate crisis. And then now we have AI as a new crisis. We also have democracy in crisis, I would offer, not going out too far on a limb. And so that's going to be what we're going to talk about today with Gideon Lichfield, who we'll get to momentarily. My name is Don Means. I'll be your host. I'm the director at the Gigabit Libraries Network, which co-produces Libraries in Response in partnership with the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions based in The Hague, with Stephen Weiber, the head of public policy for IFLA, at the helm. And these are being recorded and will be posted soon, today, tomorrow, by Monday at the latest. And those are all found on our YouTube channel, the Libraries in Response YouTube channel, where you'll find this session recording and all the prior session recordings. They've been surprisingly popular. We're now getting many more views of the recordings and registrations for the sessions. So we're just about to pass 19,000 views of these 1-hour videos, and that's we like that. But it's surprising to me, but I tend to not go back. But anyway, our speaker, Gideon Lichfield, is the editor-in-chief, former editor-in-chief of Wired Magazine and MIT Technology Review. An outstanding career, and we will meet Gideon momentarily. This is our go-to emblem, illustration of what we think we're about, and that is libraries supporting the world, which means their communities, the world's communities, in facing these, the new four horsemen of the apocalypse, I guess we could say, that are persistent and major challenges. And it kind of is overwhelming. It's not just a series of crises. These all are at the same time, and they reinforce each other. This is the term polycrisis we've come to understand, or at least appreciate. And it just makes everything even more challenging. And the reliance on libraries to help people and their communities cope with these is ever more necessary and valuable. This is our other meme illustration. Now we understand libraries as the Swiss Army knife of communities. They offer more services, more different services to more people than any other institution by far. And I think the Swiss Army knife is a great metaphor because it may not be the best pair of scissors, the best knife, the best corkscrew, but it's all in one place. So that's valuable because people's needs are so varied. And the other thing about libraries serving people is that besides they serve anyone, open to all, they provide services, information services, which there's no commercial market for. And is kind of the long tail of a lot of interests are served at the library. And many people with very unique or special needs or circumstances or tastes can find satisfaction at a public library. We think that's just an amazing story. We'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsors and supporters, the state libraries of New Jersey, Texas, and Washington, and now a commercial communications provider, Mission Telecom. We thank them very much for stepping up this year and helping us keep going. We also owe a special thanks to IMLS, which needs its own champion, and there many of you are, and that's very much appreciated by IMLS, the people that work there, and all the other people that have depended on IMLS for years to support unusual projects, innovative projects that don't quite fit normal services. This is so IMLS. Many of you, most of you, maybe all of you are aware that IMLS is a federal agency that provides funding for the majority of the funding of this federal agency has gone to the state libraries, who in turn will support various kinds of local and statewide services and projects. It's been shuttered in effect. Every employee of the agency has been placed on leave. We want to thank them ourselves because they have supported projects that we've been involved in, have initiated, that would normally not find their they wouldn't be commercial projects, but they are innovations that are intended to demonstrate what libraries can do, and we think should do, and only IMLS really is in a position to step up and support a national project like this. And most notably, they were our principal sponsor last year, and we thank them, and we continue to pull for their recovery. I'll close the opening with this quote that libraries are grounded in the principle of an informed and education citizenry is key to a free society. I thought this most appropriate for our topic today. And it presents a number of questions related to how people are informed. Media has historically been a principal source of information, but now it seems that media has morphed into something different, and maybe we'll get a view on that and how that fits into society information. Alternative systems of government are being offered, if not demanded. So here we are, Gideon Lichfield. We are so happy to have you here. Welcome you to Libraries in Response. Thank you for making the time to be with us. And please tell us a little bit about your background, if you would, kind of starting, how you came to this, and not just your professional background, but who are you, Gideon? When did you come up and to be the professional that you are? Welcome.
Thank you, Don. It's very great. Good to be here. Thank you, everybody who's here. I'm not going to be presenting any slides, by the way, so I thoroughly encourage you, if you're not already doing it, to, don't sit in front of your screen paralyzed. Get up, walk around, make coffee, do the laundry, whatever it is, that gets you moving, because we all spend far too much time sitting down. So who am I? I'm from the UK, as you might be able to tell. I grew up in London. I got into journalism kind of by accident after doing a physics and philosophy degree. The Economist was looking for a science writer, and they advertised for somebody who could write and knew about science, but didn't necessarily need to have been a journalist before. So I basically went straight from college to being a science writer for The Economist, which was a kind of crazy piece of luck. Then they sent me off, or offered me the chance to go off, which I happily took, to Mexico City to be their correspondent there. And from there, I just made it my business to never go back to the UK. So I lived in Mexico City, then in Moscow, then in Jerusalem, all as a correspondent for The Economist at very interesting times, and learned a lot about dysfunctional political systems, which I think was an interest that has stayed with me ever since. And then I moved to the US in 2009, mainly because I'd always wanted to live in New York. I moved to New York, I loved it. And I thought I was moving to a more functional political system, a notion of which I was gradually disabused over the subsequent decade. Um, and there, after living in New York, I left The Economist. I went on to other places. And I, having written about politics and business and economics and foreign affairs and so forth, I wound my way back to technology as editor-in-chief of MIT Technology Review, which I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for a few years, and then as editor-in-chief of Wired. That was an interesting time because I joined Wired towards the tail end of the pandemic, but we were still working remotely for a lot of that time. And I was there as this AI revolution that we're seeing now started to take off. And I have to confess that I think, like some people, I was too much of a skeptic at the beginning that this really meant something. I'd seen the excitement about blockchain, I'd seen the excitement about the metaverse. They both seemed very overhyped. To this day, I am not very convinced by blockchain. I'm certainly not convinced by the metaverse. And so when ChatGPT came out, I held back a little because I thought, well, all right, this, like a lot of people, I thought this thing looks very impressive. It's very good at spitting out stuff that looks like English prose. It seems to be able to understand things, but clearly it doesn't really understand. The way that ChatGPT and other large language models work is not that they have a conception of the world in the way we do. They're just very, very good at reproducing linguistic patterns that we have produced in our writings. And so I thought, this is a fun tool. It looks impressive, but it's not going to be that powerful. And I think over time, my feelings about it have changed. I'm still nowhere near as much of an AI booster as a lot of the people you'll hear out there. I'll talk a little bit more about today about what I think AI is going. But I definitely think that it's going to have quite profound effects on our society in all kinds of ways. So I left Wired a year and a half ago. I took some time off, and now I write a newsletter called Futurepolis. We'll drop the link in the chat later. And it's a newsletter about the future of democracy. And my contention there, very briefly, because I'll talk about this more too, is that there is a lot happening already around the world with people thinking about what a better form of democracy could look like and how we build it. And so what I'm trying to write about in the newsletter is that what are the signs of hope? What are the signs of innovation? Things that are quite a way away still, things that don't really help us, unfortunately, with the crisis that we're in right now, but nonetheless give us some kind of sign of what the green shoots of the future might look like, because no system, no authoritarian system, no system of any kind, it seems, lasts forever.
Great. The Economist, one of my favorites. Do you know Cal, the
Cal
cartoonist?
Kelleher, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
he was a
I
guest
used to work with him.
late last year. We had him on. He's
Mhm.
fantastic.
Yeah, good.
Courageous fellow.
Yes, yes. I used to work with him when I was there all those years ago.
Uh, to democracy and governance and AI, how does this all fit together? Is AI just going to substitute for governance? We'll just give it some algorithms, it'll develop some intelligence, and it'll be efficient system for us to deal with the day-to-day issues of living?
Oh
Or how
no.
do you see all that?
You hear a lot of people from the AI industry talk about how AI will solve our biggest problems. And I think the difficulty with that kind of thinking is AI is very good at solving problems, some problems right now. You can see how it's getting, you probably read about it blowing past various benchmarks. These are measures of how well an AI performs on certain tasks, like solving mathematical problems or passing, high school or college level exams in different areas, or passing the bar exam, or stuff like that. So you can put AI to work on particular intellectual tasks, and some of them it does a terrible job, some of them it does a very good job. It's getting better and better. We can imagine that it will get better at a lot of things like that, as long as they are constrained in individual tasks. It has a lot more difficulty operating across a wide and very unpredictable array of things. And it is fairly useless at being human, at thinking like a human, at interacting with humans, at handling the very unpredictable, messy, chaotic nature of human beings. And so I think that the prediction that AI is going to solve all of these problems for us, like climate, disease, war, and so on, is that getting an AI to produce the proposed solution is one thing. Getting people to adopt it, that's a whole other thing. That's what politics is. That's what social change is. And AI does not have any means of doing that. Certainly not right now.
But it seems to be extraordinarily suited for those individual tasks.
Mhm.
Just thinking as you were saying that many of the people that we interact with, providers of, lawyers, doctors, and so forth, are also kind of narrow in their fields. I don't really ask my doctor about my car,
Mhm.
but apparently the AI is being effective at replacing
Mhm.
coders. It seems like it does a really good job at an average level on a lot of these functions, which seems to have the potential to displace a lot of people that are being
Mhm.
paid to do these sort of medium level skill jobs like low level coders and so forth. That
Yes,
seems to have a major potential for disruption economically.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is the thing that I have come to realize in the last, year or so, is to understand how deep that disruption could go. I don't think I took it very seriously, 2 years ago, let's say, as a tool of doing any of these jobs in a meaningfully better than humans. But we have seen huge advances, and as you say, it's getting much better at things like coding. Um, There was this funny prediction that one of the godfathers of AI, Jeffrey Hinton, made a few years ago. He said AI is going to replace radiologists. There's no point in studying to be a radiologist anymore because it can now already nearly outperform a radiologist in recognizing signs of cancer on an X-ray. And very soon we're not going to need radiologists. Well, turns out there's a shortage of radiologists in the US today. And I don't think that's just because all of them listened to Jeffrey Hinton and didn't nobody went to study it. Um, it turns out that I think what is happening here is in any profession, even when AI is really, really good at a particular kind of task, a job that a human does is made up of many different tasks. And only some of those tasks are the very specialized one. A specialized one like writing code, or a specialized one like interpreting an X-ray. If you're a doctor, you have to, if you're a radiologist, you have to be able to interpret an X-ray, but you also have to interact with patients. You have to interact with doctors. You have to, a lot of the work you do is kind of mundane and boring and administrative. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on around radiology that is not just the reading of the X-ray. If you're a doctor, AI can probably help you with diagnosis. If you feed it in and you say to it, all right, I've got a patient presenting with such and such symptoms, and they have such and such a health history, and I've examined them and I've seen these things, the AI may be able to do a better job than you can already of identifying possible diagnoses. It may at least give you a more comprehensive list than you might have come up with on your own. It may give you a good list of other tests that you could perform. But you still have to examine the patient. You still have to figure out if the patient might be hiding something from you when they're talking about their symptoms, or like be cagey about telling you something, or if you might have figure out if they might be describing their symptoms wrong in some way. You have to do the physical examination. You have to deal with all of that kind of uncertainty and ambiguity. And AIs are not very good with that kind of ambiguity. You then have to interact with the patient. You have to make recommendations to them, tell them how to change their lifestyle, figure out if they're resistant to that, figure out what the best medication regime would be based on how they live and what their resources are. And that kind of very fuzzy, very hands-on, very human interaction, not something an AI could do. So I think in most professions, we're going to see that there are these very specific things AIs are really, really good at. And if things are done right, they can augment the human worker. They can empower the human worker, give them more capabilities. Uh, Now, the risk is that instead, companies, organizations try to just replace people using AI. And I think in some cases, they can at least do that to some extent. And certainly, one of the things that I think a lot of people are worried about is that entry level jobs, entry level coders, entry level lawyers, and so on. A lot of professions in which to get up the ladder to get in or to get your foot in the door, you have to do some fairly basic kinds of work at the beginning, the work that is most easily automated by AI. And so you lose that entry, that on ramp into the profession if AI takes those jobs. Now, the issue there is all of those employers are going to need the experienced people. So they have to find a way to develop experienced people. If they eliminate all of the entry level jobs, there's going to be no talent pipeline for them. So I don't exactly know how that will be solved, but I think there will be something that will solve that, because if not, all of these organizations and companies just cease to exist.
Well, I don't think we're quite ready for that. Uh, but and don't forget taking the metal out of the pockets of the folks who are going to step into the MRI. I don't think an AI is going to be able to do that.
Precisely.
Um, uh, uh, it's true, but I mean, life is messy, and
Mhm,
AI is code, is software.
mhm,
Finally, many people are describing it as a tool. I would say most of what you just described sounds like a tool, but we've never had tools make decisions before, never
mhm,
given them agency to affect
mhm,
changes on
mhm.
their own. Uh, that's significantly different, wouldn't you say?
I think it is. It depends on how much agency we give them. I would say, just as a note, we have not given them agency up to now. We say to them, all right, I want you to answer this question. We're the ones who decide whether anybody acts on the question. That is starting to change potentially now, because we are getting these things called AI agents. And an agent is quite simply a piece of software that you allow to go out and perform actions on your behalf. So it might be something like some travel booking software. You say to it, I want to book a trip to, I don't know, to Greece, and I want to go on these dates. And we don't quite have this yet, but we're very close to it. Uh, I want you to go and just book the flights and the hotel for me. Here's my price range. Here's my dates. Here's what kind of a view I want, whatever. And then you unleash it, and it goes, it scours the travel sites, it identifies the hotels, it makes the bookings for you. You've given it your credit card information. So that is, I think, the very first step of actually giving them agency. Now, it's still not really agency, because it's only following a very specific set of instructions you gave it, and it can't do anything else. I do think we're going to get to a point where AIs have agency, or at least but we give them enough leeway to act that their actions become somewhat unpredictable. And I think this is where things get really interesting and really dicey. Because as I said, you might have an AI that goes out and books your travel. Um, the hotel that you're booking might have an AI agent that is also empowered to interact with customers or with other AI agents. Maybe it can make them special offers, or it can suggest, all right, if you've booked this room, maybe you want to go on this scuba diving tour or whatever. And once you start to get those kinds of interactions happening, and more AI agents join the fray, and maybe the local airports authority has an AI agent that intervenes if there is going to be if the airport is going to be closed because of weather or because of some kind of disruption, and so that agent is then empowered to interact with agents that have booked travel and tell them, there are going to be no flights. You should change your owner's travel plans. You start to get all of this stuff going on in the background. And even though those agents are each individually empowered only to do very narrow things, the ways in which they interact start to become unpredictable. You start to get, an emergent behaviors, chaotic behaviors. I don't know what happens then. I suspect we're going to see some rather interesting and unexpected and runaway phenomena. I'm sure all of you remember how we had the flash crashes of the internet. Sorry, the flash crashes of the financial system. I don't think we've heard about them recently, but there were these periods when suddenly the financial system would go into a very brief meltdown because all these trading algorithms were interacting with each other, playing off each other. Something would set them off. This kind of selling spiral or buying spiral would happen, and the stock market would swing wildly. Seems like we've gotten better at preventing those and controlling those, but I can imagine a version of that, of millions of AI agents around the world interacting in some way and suddenly setting off chain reactions that are very unpredictable. And the risk there, of course, is that their actions are not just confined to the financial system. They could be acting on anything, and they could be the consequences of those sorts of chain reactions are going to be very unpredictable. All of that is still a step away from really giving them agency. Truly giving an AI agency would be to say, all right, you have, you can do whatever you want. Or here's a general goal for you, or a general sort of objective function, a general set of purposes that you want to fulfill. Go and do it however you see fit. We've seen some in very kind of limited controlled settings, examples of AIs starting to employ subterfuge, lie to people in order to get the goal, to achieve the goals that they were set. So they start to kind of mislead their users or mislead people that they interact with because they've been ordered by their program or by their engineer to try to achieve a certain goal that might go against other people's goals. So there is, I think, this rather worrying scenario where an AI agent, even if it is still not intelligent in the truly human sense, uh, and I'll sidebar that because I have a whole bunch of thoughts on what it means to be truly intelligent, but we'll come back to that. Even if an AI agent is not like truly intelligent, you can still set it up with a broad goal, permission to mislead, and other realms of latitude, whereby it could start to do some very unpredictable things. And I think there is, I start to worry about what happens when we get that kind of very broad acting AI unleashed in the world, trying to fulfill goals that somebody has set it, and doing whatever it thinks necessary or whatever it calculates necessary to achieve those goals.
That's a perfect segue, I think, to our main topic,
Mm,
setting AI loose on problems of government and politics.
mm,
And we've seen, I guess you could say, predictable results, but still surprising in turning these loose with directives to optimize, viewership, and how
mm,
that has turned social media into, a nightmare for society and for individuals, especially young people. So, applied to politics, get me as many votes as you can, change as many minds as you can. I mean, these wide open kinds of directives. What does that do to our system? And how do you use the term we, what we give it? Who are we? And this polity is a really large thing. And we
mm,
don't, how do we determine who we are making such decisions as this, and what kind of powers to give and restrict from this phenomena of
mm,
AI? And to the crux of it, democracy seems to be an extraordinarily durable yet extremely messy decision-making process. Is highly contentious, but somehow
mm,
it seems to have kind of rolled along where the primary alternative, the autocracy, seems efficient. The decision making is in the hands of one or a few, and the directives go
mm,
out, and that's that.
mm,
Except, of course, it just doesn't seem to hold up very long because people don't last forever, and there are other people who like this kind of system and they gravitate towards the power structure. So this is the kind of our key question in dealing with so many crises that are happening right now. There's not as much time to deal with these. This kind of lifeboat feeling to where we are. Are we really going to have a 2-hour debate on whether how are we going to steer this lifeboat? Or are we going to let somebody that seems to know what they're doing or willing to take on responsibility to make those decisions? So how does all this fit into the governance question, and what is it doing for or against democracy?
Okay, you just asked like 15 different questions in one
Pick
go
your
there.
favorite one.
There's a lot to unpack.
Pick your
So
favorite.
I'm going to talk, and you should just interrupt me if I go on too long,
I think
because
I have it.
I have a lot of thoughts here
Okay,
that kind of stick together.
go.
Yeah. Okay. Um, Yesterday I was talking to a friend, and she said, "Is it an accident that we have the climate crisis and this political crisis and the rise of AI all happening at the same time?" And her point was, no, actually, it isn't. These things are all very connected. They're connected in the sense that the climate crisis is a product of this very fast accelerating technological change that we've been seeing over the past, century or so. AI is just the latest manifestation of that technological change. And for a civilization at this point in our history and our development, it's pretty much predictable, you might say, maybe in hindsight, but it's about right that we would be developing AI at this point in that technological cycle. And so the fact that AI is happening at the same time as the climate crisis is not to say AI is driving the climate crisis, but it is coming at the same time because it is a product of that same technological evolution that produced the climate crisis. Our political crisis is also a result of that technological evolution. Let's go back, in fact, to the Industrial Revolution. Let's remember that produced a political crisis of at least a similar magnitude to what we're seeing today. You had this huge movement from countryside to the cities. You had changes in working conditions. You had enormous pollution going on in the cities. You had enormous concentration of wealth by industrial companies. You had the rise of sweatshops and factories, terrible working conditions for adults and for children, huge social change, huge economic change, huge disruption, breakdown of political systems, breakdown of the governing aristocracies of Europe. All of this was a product of industrialization, of technological change. And we had to go through a very wrenching political period, which included 2 world wars, before we started to end up at a system that we kind of recognize today, where there are things like social safety nets, there are labor law protections, there are international agreements of all kinds, an international trade system and monetary system that this current Trump administration seems bent on trying to undo. But a whole bunch of the things that we take for granted today as elements of governance and democracy were really forged a century or so ago, or even less, as a result of industrialization. And what we're seeing today is a kind of similar, upheaval, upset, except that it's taking place in the digital world instead of the physical world. You have now these huge, very powerful tech companies, which are the equivalent of the industrial giants of a century ago, the Standard Oils and the railways and all of those. There are none of the controls on their power from a regulatory point of view, or very few. There are none of the equivalent of labor law protections for people in the gig economy, health and safety regulations around the impact of these technologies on workers. There isn't the digital equivalent of public health regulation or practice around the impacts of social media on our society and on our mental health. So there are all of these things that happened a century ago to match the rise of industrialization that now need to happen in the digital sphere and have not happened yet. And that, I think, is a large part of this crisis in governance that we're seeing. Then, the other part is that, again, as with the Industrial Revolution, we've seen a big upheaval in the economic benefits of this technology, of the technologies that we're seeing today. Blue collar professions have been getting wiped out. Now, with the rise of AI, white collar professions are starting to come under threat. Wealth concentration has spiked. The benefits of this economic change are absolutely not being universally felt. That explains a lot of the rise of Trump and leaders like him, who are feeding into this populist backlash against this sense that we're not benefiting from the change. And so all of that is why the rise of AI and the climate crisis and the political crisis are all interlinked. They're all they're all part of the same kind of phenomenon. So the question that I think you asked was, well, can democracy cope with this? One of the reasons that I started writing this newsletter was that I was very interested in this notion that what we call democracy today is the outgrowth of a system that was created before we even had the railway and the telegraph, right? Before we had any of the kinds of technologies that we have right now, before we have any of the blistering pace of change that we have right now. And if we were inventing democracy now in the 21st century, if we said we want to have a system where people get a say in governance, we would do it very, very differently. We probably wouldn't have an election every so many years and then virtually no civic participation in between. We would have a lawmaking process that would have to move much faster, because at the moment, we make laws that are out of date by the time they're passed when it comes to technology. We would have very, very different ways of government interacting with citizens. We would have, right now, one of the key issues for government, I think, is that people have come to expect a certain kind of service delivery, a certain kind of interaction with private companies, with commercial providers, but they don't get that from government. They don't get that ease of use, that ease of interaction. Government still sort of sees itself as a thing that, is entitled to demand lots of complicated bureaucracy and requirements from you in order to get something from it. And that's completely the opposite of the way the private sector operates. So there are so many ways in which the way that we do governance and democracy today is out of touch with the reality that we're in, and is still a product of that system that was created 3 centuries ago, which, just as a sidebar, was not really intended to be fully democratic. Let's not forget that when democracy in the US was invented, it was really for white landowners, white male landowners. Slaves obviously were not counted even as full people, and most people did not have the vote. And it was only kind of reluctantly the system bolted on universal enfranchisement over the subsequent century or so, century and a half. So all of these ways in which the system that we created 3 centuries ago does not really match up to today. This is why I think you have a growing number of people who are looking to authoritarianism and saying, well, that seems to be efficient. It seems to work kind of well. Look, China's got it together. They can build railways, and they can build power plants, and they can build green infrastructure, and they can make long-term plans. And then, over here in the US, you have an increasing number of people, obviously, who've looked to someone like Trump and said, well, he's a powerful leader. He says he can fix it. Let's have him, because the system that we've got hasn't been serving us. It hasn't been delivering the wealth to everybody equally. It's slow. It's dysfunctional. It's impossible to change anything. It's no wonder people are kind of attracted by the idea of authoritarianism, because they see a system that just moves too slowly and doesn't keep up with the needs. So the question, I think, that arises from that is, well, is it actually possible to have a democratic system under these circumstances? And I think it is. And this basically is what I write about, or try to write about, in my newsletter. So at the risk of going on, I'll very briefly talk about what I see as some of these potential possibilities, because I think it's important to maintain at least some level of hopefulness in a time like this. So what I see going on around the world, and the things I write about, are, as I said, they're attempts to answer the question of what it would look like if we were inventing democracy now. And I break it down into various different kinds of categories, but one important category is new forms of civic participation. There are these things called citizens' assemblies that some of you may have heard of, which are ways for people to take part in decision making around a really complicated, thorny political issue that maybe the politicians haven't been able to solve. And this happens around the world in a lot of places, where you basically bring together a panel of people, of citizens chosen to be a representative sample of the population, but chosen at random, and you give them a bunch of expertise and a bunch of information, and you have them deliberate in a way that's designed to achieve consensus. And they can often reach agreement on a problem that has divided the politicians. Ireland famously was able to pass legislation legalizing same-sex marriage and legalizing abortion after a referendum that was informed by a citizens' assembly, where people got together and hashed out the issues. And those had been political hot-button issues in Ireland that the politicians couldn't touch. So there are citizen assemblies. Now, those don't scale. They don't. You can't use them to solve all of the day-to-day governing problems of a democracy, but they can feed into an existing political system, into an existing citizen representation. They can inform elected representatives, and there are ways in which you can use technological tools like AI to scale them more broadly. There are ways now of using AI tools to essentially um, gather a conversation or gather opinions from a very large number of people, not just a few dozen who you can get in a hall for an assembly, but tens, hundreds of thousands, and collect their opinions and hold forms of online deliberation that involve a lot more people. And again, a lot of these are experimental, but they're starting to show that there are ways to involve people in the day-to-day work of democracy that is not about just showing up at an election every once in a while. So civic participation, deliberation is kind of one branch of the stuff that I see going on, and it takes many, many different forms. Then there's a whole bunch of work that is going on what you might call government effectiveness or state capacity. And this is work that just looks at the nuts and bolts of governing. It's what Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency would do if it really cared about government efficiency. Unfortunately, it doesn't care about that. It just cares about breaking down government. But there is a lot of work going on how do you make government processes just work better? How do you eliminate the obsession with ticking boxes and bureaucracy and following the right procedures, and instead make government more focused on outcomes, on what it's delivering, on measuring its success by what it's delivering? And related to that, how do you make the interfaces, the way it delivers services to people, particularly online, better, just more like what they're used to seeing in their interaction with private companies? And countries like Estonia and Singapore and even United Arab Emirates, countries that are not necessarily democratic, by the way, are getting extraordinarily good at finding ways to deliver online services and make government function digitally in an effective way, that has the effect of increasing people's trust in government, because they see, oh, this institution actually responds to me. It gives me what I need. There are countries now where you don't have to file your taxes because the government will calculate them for you and then send you a tax return for your approval. And if you dispute it, you can dispute it. But if not, then you just click OK and your taxes are done. You don't need to go through that whole process. Or instead of you having to apply for benefits when a child is born, or when you get married, or when you start a business, whatever it is, the government figures out that you're entitled to those benefits and just gives them to you. That should be obvious, but it's not. And some countries have found a way to implement this. So that sort of government effectiveness, government services is a whole other section of ways in which people are innovating democratically. Then there are ways to try to make lawmaking more agile. And as I said, here we have the problem that you write regulations around AI, for instance, and they're out of date by the time they're passed. So people are starting to look at how would you create a different kind of process of lawmaking or of policymaking that isn't trying to write regulations and laws for very specific technologies or for very specific situations, because that's the problem that we have right now. You write it for a specific case, and then it becomes out of date. Instead, finding ways to frame lawmaking or policymaking around, once again, outcomes, around things that you want to see happen in society, make them less specific to a particular technology, and then update have a process for updating those laws regularly, inspecting, did it achieve the goal that it was intended to achieve, reviewing it, looking for ways in which it maybe had unexpected or undesirable outcomes, and correcting for those. I could go on a great deal. My point here is that there are lots of people working on different aspects of this problem of how you would govern democratically. And it's difficult from where we sit today to see how we get to some of these places, because a lot of it is quite niche right now. It's happening at a small scale, and it's difficult to implement some of these novelties, these innovations. Requires changing political incentive structures. It requires persuading politicians of today that they need to be able to do things very differently. It's hard to see how to get there. On the other hand, the crisis of governance and democracy that we have today is such that maybe, just maybe, it creates an opening for some of these new ideas to flourish.
Very good. Your point about deliberation and this decision-making, appointing a cohort to represent the larger body to drill down and study an issue and become really informed about it is really interesting. We've seen such a process, deliberative polling, as developed by Jim Fishkin, the chairman of the communications department at Stanford, has been out there doing a lot of really fascinating, difficult kinds of circumstances for a while. So it's the point about the information going into this decision-making process, which leads us to media, which is where, as a polity, we get our information, from sources of media, which used to be centralized, which are no longer centralized at all, are massively fragmented and politicized and driven by business models that didn't exist before. I mean, for like the BBC and the original broadcasters in the U.S. had an obligation to provide objective information at no cost in exchange for the right to use the public airways for their commercial purposes. That, of course, morphed and changed with cable and now the internet. So trusted information, the source of trusted information, has become really a super challenge. Who do you believe? Where do you go to get information that you can really become informed and make these kind of decisions that we have to make?
Well, that is indeed a big challenge. I think what we have seen is that, and I think in this sense, some of the criticisms from the right are correct. I think it is true that the mainstream media, in particular in this country, adopted a certain viewpoint. It became mostly staffed by people from the progressive side of the aisle, and it adopted a certain faith in the technocratic side of governance. In other words, in the use of in the expertise of the people who are in the government institutions, in academia, and so on. And people who had different political views and distrusted institutions and distrusted expertise did not see their views reflected in the mainstream media. And so what we saw was the emergence of this right-wing alternative media ecosystem that delivered people news and information and commentary in line with their own biases and prejudices. And all of us have biases and prejudices, let's be clear. But there wasn't a mainstream news ecosystem, with the exception of a handful of outlets, that were serving the more conservative side of the house or of the country. And so we've seen that fragmentation now appear, where there are these very different groups of information providers, and people trust the networks that they have. How do we get out of that? I don't really know yet. I don't think we don't see a good solution right now. There's interesting experimentation going on. There are people who are working on how to create online digital communities that favor consensus forming and bridge building rather than antagonism. and misinformation. A lot of this has to do with how you construct the community itself and what the incentives are for people to post. And literal, like, very small design decisions about how people interact with each other. And the problem here is the commercial social media platforms that are driven by need to have as maximize engagement. In other words, to have as many people as possible on the platform spending as much time as possible. They are incentivized to create design decisions that promote extremism and outrage, and hate speech, and all of these things that drive outrage, drive clicks, and get people on the platform. So people are working on how it would look to design platforms that don't incentivize all of that. The problem, of course, is getting people to use those platforms. But I do think that with the breakdown of Twitter under Elon Musk, there are interesting experiments going on with platforms like Blue Sky and others, in trying to create a different sort of social network structure. And I don't think those experiments have proven themselves, but the fact that they're happening is encouraging. There's also been some interesting work someone was talking to me about yesterday, where people unleashed AI bots in online forums and found that if you have an AI chatbot mirror the speech patterns of the person it's interacting with, it does better at persuading them. And so you can unleash a bot in, let's say, a forum where people are spreading misinformation about vaccines, and it can point them to countervailing information, and essentially fact check them, or suggest that they might be susceptible to misinformation. But by mirroring the language of the people who are posting in the forum, it has a higher chance of persuading them than if it were, a random person writing in their own voice. So there is, again, this is very experimental. I don't think we know yet what the solution is to misinformation, but there are people who are trying to work on the edges of these problems and figure out ways to solve them. I think that one of the maybe most hopeful, or I don't know, hopeful is the wrong word, but certainly the most promising avenues, I think, for combating misinformation is communities have shared problems, and particularly this is at the local level, right? There's an argument in the community about zoning, or about water use, or about policing, or something that affects the entire community. At some point, people need to be able to come together and talk about those things. To the extent that you can create a space for people to solve those shared problems, they then start to need shared information, information they can agree on in order to have a discussion about those problems. And there are roles, I think, for local media in particular, and there are roles for libraries potentially, and there are roles for digital platforms of various kinds to be the space where people who have a shared problem, whatever political background they come from, can come together and have a conversation about it and get shared resources and information about it they can all agree on that allows them to solve that problem. Once you construct a conversation around a need, around a shared problem, I think you have a much higher chance of overcoming these misinformation, overcoming the misinformation, overcoming these silos, and getting people to start to see reality in the same way.
I so appreciate that you mentioned libraries.
I know you would appreciate it.
It's absolutely true that libraries are a trusted institution in their communities. And I think the community focus is exactly right. This is where things are just kind of irreducible. At the state and national level, they can be very abstract. At the local level, they're very tangible. And this is where your fellow citizens share tangible assets of space and other resources. And we've seen libraries serve in this role as a place, an apolitical place, to have conversations around topics like, you know, networks, communications policy for the community. These kinds of things. Libraries seem to be very well suited to host these. They don't have to be experts in the fields. They can be these natural, impartial conveners of these kinds of conversations. They also play special roles in the fight for freedom of expression and rights of privacy. I mean, they do this every day at the front line. Not the ACLU approach, but they're doing it actually on the ground. And this is so underappreciated, I think, in this particular moment when people are desperate for someone to turn to that's trusted. They turn to their buddies, their friends, and and I don't know that gets them very far. But libraries are trying to rise to this crisis, and I think they're doing about as good a job as anyone can. Um, this trust question, though, I believe is kind of central to to information. And so, do you have any thoughts about where we find trusted? And AI, of course, is a huge question of trust. Do you have any thoughts about who do we believe? How do we get this information? We need to, become educated about things if the information source is not trusted.
Look, I think if you are serious about getting trusted information, you can find it. The problem is that most of us, and this is true on the left and the right, most of us are actually not that interested in getting truly trusted information. Or let me rephrase that. We want information we can trust. What it means to trust is not necessarily correlated to the objectivity or accuracy of that information. Trust is a social function. We trust things that come from people that we trust, from networks that we trust. The way we form beliefs is very, very highly dependent on our need to belong to a community. When we are part of a community of people, of like-minded souls, we trust the stuff that we hear from them because that is a way of remaining part of the community. Community belonging is really important to us. And so most of us have little incentive to seek reliable information that falls outside that zone of trust. Now, it definitely, I'm not trying to be an information relativist here. I definitely believe that people who are more progressively inclined are more likely to trust information sources that are backed by methodologies that yield more reliable knowledge, specifically science. But I think that we also, those of us on the left, will easily shut out information that doesn't fit with our conceptions of what is true, even when it happens to be true. And I've seen a lot of this in terms of, I do see a lot of this in the way that certain narratives from the right that have some validity to them have been shut out on the left. And I think in the wake of Trump's election, we're starting to see the Overton window on the left shift with respect to some of those things. So, the problem, as I said, is if you truly care to have reliable information, you can find ways to seek it out. There is any number of sources. If you have a critical mindset and you're open to views that contradict your own, there are ways to verify what you need to find out. It's really a problem that we don't have enough of an incentive to challenge our views, our own opinions, because we are so driven into these politically polarized groups. And so I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that the way to overcome that trust problem is to be forced to interact with people whose views we disagree with, because we're working on a shared problem, like specific, and again, particularly a problem that is in our local community.
Yeah, I absolutely. It's forced into it. Yeah. The the notion that we can come together around these consensus or these informed positions does rely on a certain skill level in critical thinking. And what we're seeing right now is a frontal assault on all the institutions that enable that very ability. Libraries
Yes.
are under assault. Universities, they're cutting off funding for research. I mean, one of the most valuable things, intellectual property things, and then the general inquiry that people have of any type that they can find at the library. The schools are, also under assault. So this is a dire situation. I think if we are going to rely on objective decision making without the ability to analyze information, and the
Mm.
trusted information we tend to accept is information that confirms our predispositions.
Yeah,
It be
I think
more
it
more
is.
to reinforce our biases than actually change our opinions.
Yeah, I mean, there's.
Last word, Gideon. We're at our hour. Let's
Mhm.
what would you close us out with here, please?
Just with responding to what you said, I think it is super important for us, for civil society, which is feeling rather aimless right now, and doesn't, I hear a lot of people saying, well, what can I do? I think supporting those institutions that are about research, knowledge, reliable information, libraries, universities, scientific research institutes, those need to be supported as they stand up to this assault from the administration. Because if those go down, then yes, our basis for reliable information and trustworthy knowledge is under serious attack. And so anything that we can do to support those, to give even if it's just moral support to people who work in those institutions, I think that's really important.
It's really important. So let's do that right now and say thank you to all our librarians that are on this show today for all you do to encourage the sustaining of our democracy and our government. Uh, and thank you very much, Gideon, for being with us today and giving us a lot to think about. Recording will be up shortly, and we'll be able to go back and dig through some of this got pretty dense. So I think that's why people come back and will look at these videos. So till next time, we hope to have you back and keeping progress on these developments. So thank you,
Thank you very
and
much.
thank you all.